Welcome back, and thank you for tuning in on Dutch Game Garden Q&A sessions. Today we talk to Oscar Hogervorst of Ludens Labs. Oscar, would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Oscar Hogervorst. I have a small company, Ludens Labs, with which I help different game companies to basically do the data-related stuff right. A lot of game companies don't really like doing that. They like to, make games or sell games. So I help them with the data stuff. And goes from implementing analytics to actually making the analysis, so the translating what we see in the analytics tools to actual points of improvement. So in that sense, it sort of moves into the game design space as well a little bit. And I've been doing that for about 3 years now. Recently, I've also been working a lot with Steam, people trying to sell their games on Steam and seeing how we can create tools specifically for these people to help them be able to sell their game better, basically on Steam.
Yeah, you call these actionable metrics, right?
Yeah, of actionable insights. I mean, I say that because a lot of times when people are doing stuff with analytics, they tend to start out with looking at the awesome numbers or, the awesome graphs, the ones that really pop or shine or stand out. But
how do graphs shine?
Well, if you open up Google Analytics or Game Analytics, they sort of determine which graphs you probably think are most relevant. And what I was about to say is that it can be tempting to look at those type of graphs, but in the end, you only want to look at the stuff that actually helps you to make your game better. And that's the point. So part of my job is to do the translation of those metrics and insights, but other part of the job is also to determine what is relevant, because not everything is. I mean, just as much as some companies track too little data or too little things, there's also companies, I'd say, that track too much, because if you have too much data, it also can become difficult to understand what you're actually looking at, or it may become tempting to sort of go into a really, zoom into a really specific detail, while maybe, something at a more global level is broken or should be fixed. So.
Yeah, because with all these data that you get a good insight in your customer segment, right?
Yeah, I think it's good to say that there's different types of data. There's the market data. That's, I think, what you're referring to right now, and it's more about how many people are playing these type of games, or how many people do even own an iPhone or whatever. Then you have the behavioral data, so that's more what I was talking about, like tracking inside the game and being able to see how people navigate and progress through your game. And then I guess you could also say there's sort of more marketing related data. So do people actually read our emails, and do they actually respond to what we want them to do? And I think the commercial data is somewhere in between those two.
In between behavioral and marketing then?
Yeah. And that's about getting people to actually make money for you. So do they actually watch your ads? Which of the positions are favorite or work better? Do they buy your DLCs or your in-app purchase?
Yeah, we have a group with like loads of people with different backgrounds and completely different games from one another. So a wide variety of genres and playing styles. Where do you start?
Where do you start? Well, I think I was thinking about this, and I think the most important thing to realize is that when you're working on analytics, you're always basically looking at the weakest link in your game. You're looking at the part that can use the most improvement, basically. And to do that, I believe that it's best to sort of zoom out and look at the most top-level metrics that you can find. Things that you probably heard of, like the retention, the monetization metrics, like the conversion rates and those type of things. And then see which of those metrics are underperforming. So if you see, for example, your game has a really high day one retention, a lot of people come back after the day after they've installed it and played it for the first time, but you have a really low 7-day retention, then you know that something is going wrong, not in the first session, but around the second session or maybe the third playing session. So that helps you to identify where to look for points of improvement.
So if we talk about retention, you say you have day 1 retention, day 7 retention, day 30 retention, day whatever retention.
180, whatever.
How do you measure those? Do you measure the login, or do you measure how far they go, or do you typically measure the time spent in your game? And is this time actually spent in your game, or is the game just on? Like
well, it's a lot of different questions, I guess, in one. Retention is a pretty set metric. I mean, there's still a lot of ways to calculate it, and different tools tend to do it a little bit differently. But the classic retention, the one that most people talk about, and the one that a publisher wants to know about if they ask you about your retention, that basically just means of all the people that started playing your game yesterday, how many of those, the percentage of those people that play it today. That's your day one retention. And the same with the, if you make it a 7-day gap, like 7 days ago, of all the players that started exactly 7 days ago, how many of those are playing your game still today?
What are good retention rates?
It's really hard to say. It really depends on the genre, on the platform, on everything. So there's not even a sort of a benchmark that you can say like it's average out to this. It's really different. Sometimes a really low retention rate can be very good because it's a difficult category.
So when would the low retention rate be good?
There's games that the more like snack type of games that don't need a really long-term retention. So that curve is a bit steeper, basically.
What kind of games would that be? Like snack games?
Yeah. Well, like the shorter games, action games, mostly what we call, I guess, the classic casual games, like the simpler type of games with not a lot of progression in it. For those games, you can expect that they have probably a good retention to start out with, like the first day and the third day will also probably be good, but there's not a lot of people that you can expect they're still playing your game after 90 days.
So Flappy Bird will be a good snack game then?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. And other types of games that rely way more on the progression and maybe on a storyline that's in there, or just being a more complete game experience, I guess. They can, if it's also a game that is in a specific niche, that can scare away maybe people in the start, but the people that stick after the first day or the second day, they will probably stick for a longer time.
So what kind of games would that be? Are those the typical resource management games, like based on farm?
Yeah, I think those are maybe in the middle, but you can think about MMOs, for example.
So we might be playing World of Warcraft, and if I have a retention rate of...
Do people still play that?
Yeah, definitely. I know, but if I have a retention rate of 4 years, that's quite significant, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. It's not really how it works. I think if they look at their 4-year retention rate, I guess it would still be like 0.000001%. And I mean, that's good for you, but yeah, I don't think they can really do anything about that specifically, but a more interesting metric for them would probably be like the age of the profiles of people playing in general, like the average age.
And why would that be more interesting?
Well, like I said, if you look at retention, you look at specific bracketed intervals, I guess you can tell it, you can name it, but that doesn't really make sense for these long type of periods. So yeah, the sample size of the people who are still left after 4 years of playing it's such a small number that it doesn't really tell you anything useful. So in that case, you can maybe look more generally at things like the average profile age, or the time since your last login, and then sort of try to correlate those.
I'd like to talk about the behavioral data that you take from the game, or the play metrics, so as they are called, right? I remember that a talk by Alessandro Canossa, who was able to determine whether or not someone was getting fatigued or annoyed by playing the game. Yeah, frustrated. He merely looked at the metrics and depicted when someone was acting annoyed or frustrated, and then they changed the game accordingly. What kind of play metrics do you typically look at when you start a game for, let's say, a card game, an online card game?
Well, first let me say that the type of thing that you mentioned, I think that for a lot of companies that's another extra next step, like the dynamic difficulty, or even a sort of behavioral-based difficulty or behavioral-based challenge. I think a lot of companies are actually a couple steps behind that for now. A good first step would be to measure measure it at all, and then using that data to improve it for yourselves and improve it through the development iterations, basically. Instead of it's another dimension once you really want to sort of tailor these type of things for every player.
So these play metrics are basically more in-depth metrics, but you start out with more retention-like metrics?
No, it can be the same things. You can look at the same things. I mean, but it has to do with what you do with the data. I mean, if you have a game like that, the game itself responds to what it sees. So you have to sort of program in specific business rules, and you have to understand the psychology behind it, and it's super complicated. Let's just take a step back and first measure the right things and look at it ourselves for all the players, not just for one specific player, and see, okay, how can we make the game experience overall better for everybody? And then after that, maybe look into, okay, are there any sensible groups to differentiate in terms of the difficulty or any demographic or whatever that makes sense, and then try to see if it makes sense to give those different groups a different experience. And then you're sort of halfway to giving everybody a tailored
play experience.
But that doesn't happen a lot because it's really difficult.
So could you name a game that you started out, and which metrics did you start to measure?
Well, actually, I don't even have to call one specific game because if you look at the metrics, when we start out with measuring a game, we put the telemetry inside the game. So that's step number one. Like pick the right tool and then put it inside the game. Telemetry, it's basically it means something that tracks something.
Something that tracks something.
Yeah, I guess it's probably more complicated than that. So that's the first step. And what you do next is try and find like the sensible stuff. What do you need to know to make your decisions? It can be the difference between people starting levels and people completing them, or winning versus losing. It can be people clicking buttons or progressing through your storyline. It can be all those type of things. So what we usually start out with, once we selected the tool that fits the game, then we basically make a spreadsheet. Yeah. So in this case, I would more say like the stuff that is about like the core mechanics of your game, like actually playing interacting with the play in the type that you've designed it. That can be, I think you can differentiate that from the app, basically the application, and interacting with the application. So if you start the application, you're not starting to play. There's some steps in between. It isn't if it's not the controls of the game, I guess. If you go to
navigating your menu doesn't sound like
start level
and
right? Like moving your player. Well, if you're moving your player, then you're in gameplay, I guess. So then it's play. Yeah. And the play part is also the most difficult one, and it basically for one reason. It can be really tempting to if you're making a type of overview like I've shown, you think, well, we can also measure. We put in an event every time someone picks up a bonus or a coin. Oh, we can also put in an event every time he kills an enemy, or we can also put one in every time he jumps, and then all's good. And then you have 1,000 players in your game, and then you get an email from Google Analytics that you exceeded their 3 million event limit, and then you have to sort of scrape them all out again. So that's sort of a risk, something that you could think of. Yeah.
So when do these behavioral metrics turn into marketing metrics? How can you use those, or are they completely different?
Well, I think the part where they overlap most is in segmented communication, where you can use things that you know about your players to communicate the most relevant and most fitting message to them. That's not something that happens a lot, but it's something that could be as easy as making 2 groups instead of sending that one email to everybody. Maybe trying to find out which of the players are actually still playing and which of the players haven't logged in for a month or 2, and send those 2 different offers because they're in a different
Customer segment.
state of the life cycle, basically. So that's I guess that's the most important part where they overlap, I guess. And otherwise, I think there's a lot of market and marketing metrics that are quite separate from the behavioral metrics. Whereas one of the categories is more about improving and measuring about how you can improve how to sell your game, and the other one is more about measuring and improving the game itself and the experience. And of course there's overlap because you sell more games if more people play them, and if they play them longer and etc. But it's still a little bit separate, I'd say.
Okay. Well, we'll go out for our sponsors.
Yeah, if you want to meet developers or interesting partners in an informal way. Not a lot of pressure. It's really fun.
Yeah, we're at the Dutch Game Garden Lunch because we heard it was a great opportunity to show our game and also to get more contact with in the industry.
Welcome back. I think I was supposed to say that. Okay. So I have a follow-up question about the thing you mentioned before. I went to a presentation with Gamescom or DevCom in August, and it was about the retention rate and freemium games, and that freemium games need a certain type of retention to actually make money, and that every publisher uses a different retention rate that they will look for, like 7 days or 5 days. And you said that you see a difference between improving the game and improving the sales when it comes to data, and they were mostly focused on improving the game so that at least you get that retention rate to a certain degree, and that's enough for freemium games. But is it really enough, or do you need to do more than just improve the game enough?
I think what all these publishers know, and what's I think it's a general knowledge, is that improving retention is way harder than improving monetization. So if you have a game that is not able to keep people interested for a certain period of time, then that's not something your publisher can fix. But if you have a game that is very good in retaining people, and I've seen this among my clients as well, but just hasn't figured out yet how to monetize these people, then that's the golden egg for these type of publishers, because they know that the basis is all right, but they just need to find maybe a slightly different way to monetize it, or some fine tuning in that aspect.
Okay, and so what would you measure if you want to improve the monetization part?
Well, the most important thing about monetization is it depends on your business model, but conversion rate is very important. And in the end of the line, it's and that's something that publishers will also look for, the average value of a player. So how much money does an average player bring in? And it's totally different for a paid game and an ad-based freemium game, or in a purchase-based freemium game. But that's the most important thing, because if they know that they will make $2 for every average player, then they know they can spend $1.90 to buy a new player. And that's eventually what a lot of those companies are looking for. Those type of situations, money printers.
Hello, my name is Juke. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
You were brought to the attention of Google and their max event limit, like 3 million, you said. When you're tracking behavioral aspects, like maybe you're making a heat map of your game, like where do the players go to most often, when do you decide you have enough data on that? And when do you decide to remove those and maybe add different ones?
That's a good question. I think that it makes perfect sense to have a type of list like that and have it be dynamic. So it makes sense that you add certain stuff once you try to figure something out and you can't figure it out with the analytics that you have in your game at the moment, that you add something specifically to figure that specific problem out. Yeah, I'm thinking about an example of a client where we did the opposite, actually, because they were tracking so much things about connectivity within the game, because it was a multiplayer game. It was very important that there wasn't a lot of lag and stuff. And eventually they were tracking so much different things about that they couldn't actually sort of summarize it anymore to one number. Like, how are we actually doing in terms of, you know, the ping and the latency and the frame rates and all that. So then we actually removed all that and then just made it like 1 or 2 metrics instead.
When do you really decide when you have enough data on that specific subject? And like, is it just when you like you have a goal in mind of what you should do? And like, if it doesn't happen, like, is that enough data for you? Like, you know people are not following it, and then you need to change up the game design, or maybe you should embrace it and go a different route.
Well, I think in terms of having enough data, there's 2 dimensions. You have the dimension of the number of different types of things that you're measuring, and the other dimension, I guess, is the number of players that you have in your game. So yeah, if you only have 10 players in your game and you track everything they do, then still that's not very reliable data, of course. I don't have to tell you guys, but yeah, in terms of how much events are enough, I guess. It really depends on your game and on the questions that you have at that moment. When you're in a situation that you try to find out why something really specific is not working or something really specific is working, I mean, that's also sometimes the case. Why are people engaging with our game in this way? It's not a problem, but why do they do it? It's not like how we designed it, for example. Yeah, then that's still... If you can't answer those type of questions, then you need to add some specific events. I do want to say that you should really think about like which of these things do you want to measure, and not just put in as many as you can. Think about the things, the most important decision points in your game, for example, the most important points in the progression of the player, and go from there and see, okay, we see that a lot of people reach level 3, but there's quite a few less people that start level 4, so what's going on there? Is that a sort of a natural break point in the first session, like they've been playing for 5 minutes, or is it something that's specifically in that level where they stop?
All right, thank you.
My name is Daan Kreek. I would like to ask you a few questions, actually. First of all, what can you tell us a bit about your clients? What kind of clients do you have?
It's are different types of companies in the Netherlands and all over the world. Mostly mobile games and PC download games. No console games, but furthermore anything like social games, to puzzles, to anything.
But so smaller companies or bigger companies?
Also quite different, varying in size. So it's not the biggest companies. They usually have their own analysts. So it's mid and small combined. For example, Gamius, Little Chicken, to name a few. But also there's more serious games, applications. IJsfontein, for example. I do work for them as well. Because even though it's a serious game, I mean, there's may not be as much pressure on monetization as you would expect from a commercial game, but still, it's very interesting for the people who give them the assignment to understand how people are actually interacting with the product, and also to have sort of get learnings from the content. If it's, for example, if it's a training or something where employees of a company have to make certain decisions, you want to know. Right, if they make the right decisions, and if they make the wrong decisions in specific fields, that's a really good reason to maybe do some extra lessons in that, or teach them a little bit extra about it.
Yep. And what is your business model? So how do you get your money? These clients, do they pay you per hour or per project, or
one of those? Yeah.
Okay.
So it's either hourly or on project base. Then I'll just make an estimation of the type of work that I think needs to be done, based on what I can see in the analytics, what there's already available, and what we need to implement and do. And then it just amounts to a certain amount of hours and a certain amount of euros.
So would it also be interesting to do it on a rev share base?
People asked me that a couple times. I haven't said yes yet, because I think I would do it only if I really believe in the product, I guess. And I haven't seen yeah, I haven't had an opportunity to do that with a product that I really think that's going to work. So I guess that's the situation. So it could be happening, but not at the moment. And it can also be tricky, by the way, because a lot of you probably work with RefShare with your audio guy or whatever, or maybe you are the audio guy. I don't know, but it also gets tricky because if you start to split up the pie, what's a reasonable share? It's already hard to think about what's a reasonable share for the audio guy, right? And what's a reasonable share for the analytics guy?
Well, I think it all depends on what you think you can add to the game. Because, well, I see you as the most important guy for my game, actually. Because you know what to change.
Yeah.
And how to change it, maybe.
Yeah, no, I think so too. But it's really hard to explain to the... yeah, I mean, it can be the difference between doing exactly the same work and not making any money and doing exactly the same type of work and, yeah, making the right stuff and because of that making money.
My final question is, a lot of people here try to think about what they would like to measure. I would like to ask you, is there a specific thing that a lot of developers tend to forget to measure? An important thing, of course.
I think mostly it's like black and white. It's either I've looked at the data once and it's so complicated and I'll look at it later and then after a while they call me or someone else and then because they feel like I can't make anything out of it, or the other situation where it's someone that's actually already trying to find out for himself what's the most interesting stuff to know, and they all do and forget or make some mistakes on specific things. One thing that I do see that's always a really quick win to add in terms of the analytics is the progression, because it's one of the things that is not done automatically by a lot of analytics tools. I mean, if you have Google Analytics in your game, it automatically starts to get some data on returning sessions and session length and all that type of things. So then it's really easy if you have just put in some events for the progress of the player, like how much, which of the levels is he actually completing, and that's usually the first quick win, I guess.
Okay. I thought you were going to say the tutorial, but because normally people they think, but it's an obvious game, right? And then it doesn't seem too obvious for
super
players.
Important. Yeah, I think that's very, very important. But if people are, I mean, it goes hand in hand. Being serious about the analytics of a thing, and being serious about the thing in itself. I mean, if companies are really serious about their onboarding process, it's such an important aspect. It's the most important aspect, especially if you talk about retention. Then eventually you also have to take that analytics into account, because you cannot improve a thing like that without understanding where it's broken.
Can you give us an example of what you changed, what you told them to change, which made a big impact, and how big was that impact?
600%.
Wow.
Difficulty, basically. So what we did for a mobile game, we were looking at the data and we're seeing that not a lot of people were hanging in there to complete the later levels in the game. They were all sort of dropping out at the start. And what we did is basically we fixed some of the very specific levels where we saw a spike in drop-off, and also the overall difficulty. We did a sort of a short experiment with that, with 3 variations, like the old one, a harder one, and an easier one. Based on that, we saw that the earlier levels improved slightly. But because it's compounding, every player you don't lose in this first level, you have an extra chance to keep him in the second level. You have an extra chance to keep him in the third, and etc. So if you improve your first 10 levels all with only a couple % in terms of how many players are still left playing it, then that really adds up in the end.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Oscar, I'm Vincent. I've got an odd question. We want to cater with our game also to the professional players. And one of the important aspects in that is the entertainment value of a game, right? But how can you measure that? Because now we have to ask it qualitatively and see what professional players like. But are there some metrics or stuff that you can also implement in your game that help you track in that sort of stuff? Because it's really...
What's a professional player? Is that esports?
Yeah.
Okay.
but also streamers. I mean, for them, it's important that it's also fun to watch.
Well, the watchability, something like that. That's something that's becoming more important, I guess. But besides that, I mean, there's no way to say that every interaction can be quantified into one number. Like this was an 8 in terms of how much fun this player had. Is that really how it works? The only way that something like that would work is like the complex self-learning algorithms that Menno mentioned in the start. But that's also really tricky, and you have to feed it, and it's a really big project, basically. Yeah. But besides that, I mean, you can deduct a lot of things from the things that you can measure. If people interact with a specific element from your game really shortly, then it's probably not something they want to interact with. Sounds logical, but once you see it within the heap of all the other data, it can not be so logic anymore, but that still is. So things like retention and churn and those type of metrics, they are more about, okay, it has already gone wrong. Yeah. These people already stopped playing because they didn't like it overall. Yeah, and in this case, you would zoom in a little bit more and try to find like the more specific details about their playing experience that they may like or may not like. Like, what are the last things that they did before they ended the game? This could be a very interesting one. Was it that they died? Or was it that they were navigating the store? Or did they just got 10 quests at once that they felt overwhelmed? Or, something like that.
So you basically deducted from player analysis, and you figured that also might have impact on your watchability.
Yeah, and the watchability, I mean, that's... Yeah, I wouldn't know how to quantify that actually. Yeah, I guess, but these type of things, I mean, the more the core concept of your game, the artistic aspect of your game, but also I guess the watchability. That's something that's where there's a very distinct role for playtesting and the more
obviously
qualitative analysis, as opposed to the quantitative sides of the analytics. Yeah, so it's possible, but it can get tricky.
Thanks.
Can you predict the success of a game if you see the game?
No.
No?
No. You can predict quite a few things. I can predict, for example, if I only know your day 1 and day 3 retention, what your day 28 or your day 180 retention would be, and what your average lifetime of the players would be, and maybe even the lifetime value if they are already spending money. But no, you cannot. Yeah, the overall success it comes together with so many other different factors. Like some of the most important factors are you can't predict. I mean, it's hard to predict if you're going to get a feature on the App Store. From my point of view, I mean, as a business developer from the game studio, you may be able to, but I cannot see that in the data.
But I thought maybe you know a lot of stuff about the players. For instance, maybe you know that, 14 to 18-year girls like this and this and this and this. So if you have that in your game, it might be a success for them.
No, that's interesting, but it's not really the type of activity that I do, I guess. And it's also really hard. I guess you can only do that if you have a lot of games and a lot of data from a lot of different games. And it's my pool of clients, I guess, would be too small for it, to do that for all these types of specific sub-demographics.
And one other question. So nobody likes to watch ads while they're playing a game. What kind of data do you get about, during the ads, before the ads, or mostly after the ads? Do you see a shift? Do people tend to stop playing the game because of the ad? And then for the rest, my question is, does that change over time? So are people nowadays more, annoyed by ads, or less annoyed than some time ago?
Well, it's really hard to say because there's so many different ways of implementing ads in your game. You can imagine that rewarded video ads are not as big a punishment to the player as just a general interstitial.
So that's becoming more popular, I think, or not?
I think that's one of the reasons. Yeah, that it becomes more popular. Yeah.
So, but if there is a big drop, you can see it, right? After an ad.
Yeah, but it's really. I think it's rarely one specific point where you would lose them. I mean, maybe the very first interstitial that you show that would probably show a dip or a spike in churn. But yeah, because there's so many different hooks where your advertisements can be shown, and so many different types of behavior that players can have leading up to that moment. I mean, someone can play maybe 5 minutes till their first ad, and others maybe see it already in 2 seconds or something like that. But yeah, it's.
But that's normally the development company that decides where the ad is shown, right?
Yeah, but sometimes it also happens in discussion with the publishers. I mean, if you have a game with very good retention and not so good monetization, and maybe they'll say, we need to find some more moments to monetize. And if you're in bad luck, then maybe they'll say just put interstitials everywhere, and we'll see how it works. And then
Can you say this is your game, you should use this tool, and that's another game, use that tool? Is that the way you can do it, or?
No, it's it really depends mostly on the scale and on the features that you'd like. One sort of tip that I would like to give somebody else asked a question about the heat maps. I'm not a fan of heat maps, so if you want to choose a tool and you choose it specifically because it's the one that has heat maps, you maybe want to think by yourself, like, okay, what is the type of question that I want to answer with these heat maps, and is there another way to answer it? Because a heat map is a very complex thing.
Yeah, these heat map are super useful when it comes to depicting where your players run if they neglect certain parts of your game. But why do you think these aren't really useful? You can also do it in 2D, obviously.
You can also have it for those type of games, but then it's more about the screen, basically. So then you would have a heat map of the interaction with the screen, and then, surprise, surprise, it's the corner with the menu button that's dark red, and it's.
Yeah, I remember going to this one user test for a bingo game, which was really surprising. They did the eye track movement of the players. And you could see a significant difference between eye track movements of experienced player versus non-experienced players. Non-experienced players were going like this. And really experienced players were going like... It's super weird, because I imagine that when you're really good at stuff and have done it a lot, you get really systematic. They weren't. They were like all over the place. So it didn't say much, unless it said that you could sort of see who were experienced and non-experienced players. There's a lot of development in tracking more biometrics. How do you feel about those?
I think there's a place for that in the more qualitative user test type of things that you mentioned with the eye tracking. But I think it's not really possible to apply that to the big group, like the actual players. So I think it's important to do both, basically, because a lot of the times when people actually only let their moms and their friends play their games, and then or maybe they organize a more representative focus group to play their game, but there will still be a discrepancy between that group and the people who are actually playing your game eventually. Depending on the platform, that can be a really big gap.
Right. So getting an insight in the huge amount of players, thanks to the metrics that you put into the game, gives a different insight in your game than focusing on behavior data.
Yeah, it can be that can be very different, only because it's just different types of people. I mean, you can make a game and you can have a target audience in mind, but when the game comes out, a totally different target audience maybe actually plays
picking it up. Yeah. Well, Oscar, thank you so much for being here today. We talked about a lot of different things, expressed the difference between market data, behavioral data, and marketing data. Got a little bit more in depth about play metrics and tried to figure out how they turn into marketing data. Apparently, focusing on retention is an important aspect too, but obviously. And you've given us a couple of insights in our questions. So thank you so much for being here. This was the Q&A of the Incubation Day. about playing match fix with Oscar Hogervorst. Thank you very much.